Hello, my name is Baker and today I come before you with an analysis of the character known as Lahabrea, an enigma whose surface even the vaunted scholars of YouTube fail to scratch. You see, this video is host to a power of which you are as yet ignorant. It is the ultimate analysis, a video essay without parallel. The hour is at hand, behold but a sliver of my editing power, and from the deepest pit of Reddit to the very pinnacle of the heavens, the world shall tremble. Now, this analysis will cover a variety of topics that are all relevant to discussing Lahabrea's character. It's quite long and is split into multiple segments, ranging from development background, covering relevant background lore, to deconstructing his character arc, relationships with key characters, and more. As such, I recommend using the chapters feature on YouTube if you are the madman who listens to all of this in one go. Subtitles are available and any resources used in the video, such as interviews, will be listed in the description. Oh, and final spoiler warning for Imacuttlefish 6.0 and the entire Pandemonium story. Alright, so when it comes to a character like Lahabrea, I think a prudent thing to do would be to start off by going over some development history, because Lahabrea really has one of the more interesting backgrounds in the story, at least from a development point of view. It is also the thing that I am probably the most excited to talk about, since you guys know I love this kind of stuff. For those of us who have experienced Shadowbringers, which I assume is everyone watching, since why else would you click on this video, or maybe you just don't care about spoilers, what do I know? Anyway, we who have played through Shadowbringers and Endwalker have come to associate the Ascians and the Ancients with this very rich, interesting group of characters that are integral to the story of FF14, not just in terms of the plot, but these guys also tend to be the source of most of the emotional damage delivered by the riders. As such, it can be all too easy to forget that that's not how the Ascians were originally presented as, for quite a long time too. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the creation of A Realm Reborn, how they managed to salvage a dying MMO by reviving it from the ashes. It was certainly an astonishing feat by the developers, and an incredible success story by all accounts. Yet the reality is, they had to create an entirely new MMO within a time span unheard of for MMO development, all the while still updating the old version that they were about to nuke. To facilitate such an enormous task, cutting corners was an absolute necessity, and I do mean lots of cutting corners. Most people of course associate this with the technical side of things, such as the reducing of the graphical fidelity and animations from 1.0, or building the game off of 1.0's infrastructure, or cutting corners in a gameplay sense, such as reusing a ton of assets from 1.0, or the limited amount of voice acting featured in 2.0, or the lengthening of the game's story via introducing quests that were clearly there to pad out the game duration, or just a ton of planned content being axed, such as the Musketeer job and dozens of other things. What isn't often discussed though is the cutting of corners when it came to the actual story. There were many instances of this, and to list them all would take a while, but the most notable case of this was the design of the chief antagonists of the story, the Ascians.
I'm bad. I'm the baddest motherfucker in the world. Have you ever seen a costume like mine?
The developers basically wanted to create this larger narrative in the background with the two deities of Heidelin and Zodiac, as well as the Ascians that lurk in the shadows, who manipulate people in order to cause these world-ending calamities. I presume the idea was to make the narrative appear more epic in scope, and to be fair, it is very common Final Fantasy fare. However, they simply did not have the time or resources to flesh any of this out, something which they've admitted to in interviews. The lore behind the Ascians in particular really just boiled down to shady bad guys doing bad things in the background. Yes, really, that was the extent of the direction at the time. While I give them huge props for admitting this so openly, I can't help but find it a little amusing. They basically just threw in these elements with little to no direction and simply went, we'll figure it out later, I guess. You know, I wonder what it was like to write dialogue to a character like Lahabrea with the direction of some bad guy doing bad stuff. Make the world whole again, blah blah, Lord Zodiac, hiding and bad, must kill warrior flight, blah blah, Heart of Sabik. Ooh, Heart of Sabik, what's that? I have no freaking clue, man. It sounds cool though, so I'm adding it in. We'll just explain it 10 years from now in a raid side story.
You have a rock collection? It's a mineral collection!
Of course, I don't mean to make fun of this in a mocking way, quite the contrary. It was precisely them being so ominous with these things that allowed them to then have a lot of liberty over these elements when it finally came time to fully implement them. So credit where credit is due, it definitely worked out in the long term. I bring all of this up because it's all very relevant to Lahabrea's character. The first time they started to seriously explore the aforementioned elements, including the Ascians, was with the Warriors of Darkness storyline post-Heavensward, and even that was merely a taste of what was to come with Shadowbringers. But the issue was, Lahabrea had already been killed at that point. So Lahabrea has essentially become a face for the old design of the Ascians from A Realm Reborn through Heavensward, while Emet-Selch would become sort of the face for the actual fleshed out design of the Ascians, Shadowbringers onwards. Much in the same way, I would also argue that Lahabrea as an actual fleshed out character really came into existence only with 5.0. It may sound a bit silly because obviously he existed since 2.0, but let me explain what I mean. From my perspective, since the Ascians were just bad guys without any direction from the writers, and then saw a shift in Shadowbringers, with Natsuko Ishikawa giving them an actual purpose and motives, thereby making them actual characters, I would argue that through that decision, that's the moment Lahabrea as a character was truly born. In this sense, there exists two versions of Lahabrea. The pre-Shadowbringers one, which was just this generic bad guy, though there were a lot of memes about him, and post-Shadowbringers, aka someone who is an actual character. Naturally, I'll mainly be focusing on the latter, given there isn't a whole lot to say about Lahabrea in his original form. Well, excluding the stuff I have been talking up until this point, I suppose. In order to go with this new image of Lahabrea, since Shadowbringers, they've tried their best to improve his character in whatever ways they could. You can tell that through this revised view of him, the developers respected his character a lot more. Not only did he get an entire raid series dedicated to his character, mentions in the Shadowbringers story, a dungeon dedicated to exploring his character, as well as him being prominently featured in both of the two Shadowbringers side stories involving the Ancients, they really went the extra mile by even going back and retroactively tweaking his two encounters in A Realm Reborn and Heavensward in patches 6.1 and 6.3 respectively. In the original A Realm Reborn, the Atma weapon was for all intents and purposes the final boss. It was the classic Final Fantasy setup, where the Atma weapon is the true challenge, and Lahabrea was merely a fun little victory lap, a cutscene boss to be a bit more blunt, where you sort of just slap him a bit and he falls over. However, with the 6.1 rework, Lahabrea was turned from that pitiful kind of a bonus fight into a truly threatening encounter, which in turn solidified him as the true last boss of 2.0. This is really in alignment with how the writer's view of Lahabrea shifted. Originally, he wasn't meant to be such a big threat, so it was fine for the Warrior of Light to easily overpower him with Eidolon's blessing. But with the post-Shadowbringers mindset, the developers thought he should appear a lot more threatening. And to their credit, they succeed in this with flying colors. The new Lahabrea fight is immaculate. Seriously, the new Lahabrea takes no prisoners. I mean, he really fucks you up. I was so delighted to see comments of people saying they got their asses kicked by Lahabrea. Now that's how you know they did his encounter justice. Not only is he more difficult, but he also gets way cooler animations to really drive home that this guy is on a different level than anything you've encountered prior. In addition, they reworked his kind of lame encounter in the Chemical Research Facility with Aegirum and as Ascian Prime, and similarly, he was made a lot more threatening there, and way cooler, more badass. I mean, I remember getting this thing from a roulette at one point, and we legit wiped like 3 times on that boss, which was kinda funny. The transition was not all smooth sailing, however. Making Lahabrea and Unsundered retroactively caused some issues, mainly with his perceived power levels. Since Emet-Selch and Elidibus were so powerful, why was Lahabrea so weak in comparison? They managed to sort of dig their way out of this by hand-waving it with a quick comment from Emet, suggesting that Lahabrea's constant body hopping is what weakened him over the years. I always found this explanation a bit goofy though. First of all, it's an obvious band-aid on the problem, but also, since taking over the bodies of mortals and impersonating them is one of the Ascians' trademark features, it's honestly a bit silly that the same process weakens them greatly. But it's the best they could do at the time, so I'm going to let it slide. I do find it interesting they decided to take this route at all, however. They didn't necessarily need to have Lahabrea be one of the Unsundered. They could have just kept him as kind of one of the weaker Sundered Ascians, just maybe one that held a more special position. Ergo, they wouldn't have had needed to go through all this effort to salvage his character retroactively and having to answer the aforementioned questions. But given that we know they plan content about 2 expansions ahead of time, it's logical they already had the outline for the Pandemonium story laid out back then, and Lahabrea was a good character to team it after to add some intrigue. I would also imagine another factor was simply due to his presence among the Ascians, being he shown as this kind of an Ascian overlord figure, and so they felt like he should have had been someone special, like Elidibus. Honestly, when discussing all of this, Lahabrea reminds me a lot of Zack from FF7. Without spoiling the game, Zack was someone who was a crucial character to FF7's plot, yet his character barely gets any presence in the actual game, something which developers rectified in the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, even creating an entire game with him as the main character. In much the same way, Lahabrea was an important player in the game's plot, but never really had the presence of other antagonists like Emet and Elidibus, something which they would then rectify by giving him an entire raid storyline. I should also note that just like with Zack, his story was kind of just waiting to be told, such as with the mystery behind the Heart of Sabik. The reason I'm gushing about this aspect of Lahabrea's character is I really just appreciate when writers can resist the urge to constantly create something new, fresh and exciting, and instead be able to take a step back and consider, what do we have that already exists that we could expand upon? It really adds to the richness of the story, because you never know when that one story element from ages ago might come back and play an important role. Alright, so who then is this fresh and exciting new Lahabrea that the writers conceived after the fact? Let's discuss some lore and background. As with all the other videos involving the Ancients, we are of course going to look at what the character was like before and after the Sundering. In this segment, I'll be going over Lahabrea's backstory in the world Unsundered, because the Pandemonium story began well over a year ago.
Well, maybe 3.
Thus, a recapping of events should put us all on the same page. If you feel it's unnecessary though, and wish to skip to the actual analysis and breakdown of Lahabrea's character, you can simply skip to the next chapter or use the timestamp shown on the screen. I should also note that this isn't a summary of the entire Pandemonium story. I'll only discuss things that are relevant to Lahabrea's character, and even then, I aim to be as succinct as I can. If you want a recap of the entire story and all the lore of Pandemonium, here are some options from fellow YouTubers on screen right now you can feel free to check out. Alright, enough disclaimers, let's go over Lahabrea's lore pre-Sundering. Just as with the other Ancients, it really shouldn't come as a surprise that Lahabrea has a pretty bleak and tragic backstory to him. The main difference of course is that Lahabrea's story is messed up even before the inciting incident that was the final days and the subsequent sundering of the world. Hephaestus, and yes, I know they pronounce it Hephaestus in the storyline because they slammed an O in there,
Then Hephaestos' story...
But I don't care, I'm pronouncing it like they would pronounce the ancient Greek figure in the UK. Anyway, Hephaestus was a brilliant scientist in the ancient world, specializing in fiery concepts and phantomology. It was this talent, his ability to create phantom beings of the highest complexity, which eventually landed him a seat in the Convocation of the 14, Lahabrea, the position that specializes in and holds authority over creation magics. He additionally assumed the role of the speaker for the Convocation. The seat of Lahabrea fit Hephaestus like none other. Not only did his talents of creation eclipse his peers, he perfectly encapsulated the collectivist ideal of the ancient society. He firmly believed that the need of the many outweighed that of the individual, and as such, his desire to act solely in the interest of the star was unparalleled. He was a strong leader who wore his authority without hesitation and didn't think twice to act once his judgment had been sounded. During his formative years as Lahabrea, Hephaestus came across a researcher by the name Athena. Lahabrea respected her desire for knowledge, and they often discussed how to transcend a challenge that has plagued countless researchers in the past. Lahabrea posited a theory as to how this might happen, which fascinated Athena, and their frequent conversations and shared passion finally turned their relationship romantic. Not soon after, they had their first and only child, Erichtonios. During her time with the words of Lahabrea, Athena came to them with a rock she had found, which she called Oracite. She studied it in earnest and created from it a Stygian crystal she called the Heart of Sabik. Later, Lahabrea found out that the crystal corrupts its users by magnifying their desires. Realizing the potential danger of Athena, Lahabrea came up with the idea of building a research facility with the pretense of being a prison for failed creations, but in reality, he intended it to contain his wife in order to keep her isolated from society at large. Why he did not kill her outright, or why he named her chief keyword and allowed her limitless liberties within Pandemonium without his supervision, is uncertain, but more than likely he still retained feelings towards her. This all came to an end, however, when Lahabrea heard from Agdistis, the keyword of Tartaros, that Athena was going to conduct experiments on their son, Erichtonios. Lahabrea visited Pandemonium that day to stop her evil machinations. She refused to give up Erichtonios, however, and instead gladly offered to share her point of view to Lahabrea. In an act of desperation, Lahabrea bonded souls with Athena in order to see if she ever bore any affection towards him. Upon performing the ritual, Lahabrea was both appalled at and disgusted by Athena's complete absence of compassion towards any other being, only seeing everyone and everything as mere tools to further her own ambitions. Following this, Lahabrea swiftly disposed of Athena and became the chief keyword of Pandemonium in her place. He also took the Heart of Sabik from Athena's laboratory and kept it for his own safekeeping. However, the ritual had left a mark on Lahabrea's soul. This fervent desire to ascend now festered within him as well, the presence of the Oracite's corruption threatening to quicken within him like it did Athena. Lahabrea had to act quickly, and the most logical course of action he could think of in the moment was to split his soul, so that he could contain the memories and parts of his being that were now twisted by Athena's truth. And so he literally purged that part of his soul, and, unsure of what would happen to his existence, he stored that mass of ether into a constellation crystal just to be safe. Yet this was not the only driving force for him going through with the process. For Hephaestus, he saw him acting on his emotional impulses and on his curiosity as weakness that made him falter in his duty as Lahabrea. By casting aside that side of him, he'd now be free of the burden that the other half of his soul represented, and in so doing drew him closer to his true personality, a man who thinks of naught but his duty. In other words, this act ended up making him all the more effective in his work as Lahabrea, just as he had intended. Still, it would be foolish to assume this act didn't have its fair share of negative consequences. Indeed, if one could simply purge parts of their soul with no repercussion, then surely people would be doing that left and right to mitigate their weaknesses. On the contrary, such feats are unheard of in the ancient society. When Elidibus learns of these events, he straight up calls the act bordering on insanity and Lahabrea living through the ordeal a miracle. Since he essentially rewrote his very existence, it had a huge impact on Lahabrea's personality, something that both Emet-Selch and Aegirm in particular were quick to notice. The greatest toll was put on his psyche, however, mainly through the emotional numbness that followed. He struggled to form bonds with those close to him, like his son, and he became apathetic even towards great accomplishments such as the creation of the Phoenix. In a sense, he had lost a part of his humanity. Furthermore, Athena had anticipated that Lahabrea might do something like this and had one of her followers, the keyword Hegemone, unearth the crystal that contained half of Lahabrea's soul and had this soul enter a vessel she had prepared, knowing that it would try to resurrect her and further her goals. Under Lahabrea's leadership, Pandemonium would go on to create some amazing creations, such as the Phoenix. Lahabrea himself, however, rarely visited due to him being busy attending his regular duties in the convocation, and so he was unaware that his soul had awakened as Hephaestus and started causing trouble within Pandemonium. For a time at least. Eventually, some etheric anomalies started to occur, and the convocation sent both Azem and Elidibus to investigate. Azem never arrived, as in their place was the Warrior of Light, someone masquerading as Azem's familiar. Lahabrea became highly suspicious when he didn't receive a formal report from Elidibus, but rather a communication from one of the keywords that everything was all good within Pandemonium. So he arrived within the halls of Pandemonium personally. He quickly caught wind of the situation happening in Pandemonium. His split soul, Hephaestus, had thrown Pandemonium into chaos, causing unrest and making their keywords easy targets. Hephaestus used self-same corrupting power that originated from the aura site to achieve absolute control over the minds of these keywords through exploiting strong emotions within the victims' hearts, such as Hesperos's respect for Lahabrea. His son wasn't happy to see him, however. Lahabrea and Erichtonios got into multiple arguments before Hephaestus eventually used the aforementioned power to bind Erichtonios' mind and prepared him for an experiment that would result in Athena's revival. With the aid of Themis and the Warrior of Light, Lahabrea makes it through to the bottom of Tartaros, where Hephaestus tries to complete his experiment. The Warrior of Light defeats Hephaestus, however, and Erichtonios escapes from his shackles. Lahabrea and Erichtonios then band together as father and son to seal Hephaestus back into a crystal. Following these events, Lahabrea senses Athena's tinkering within Hegemone, but knows he's not powerful enough to actually do anything about it. After thinking about it long and hard, Lahabrea decides to invoke the constellation crystal containing Hephaestus' memories in order to make his soul whole again. He excises Athena's influence from Hegemone and puts her in charge. Without Pandemonium to divert his focus and his soul being whole again, Lahabrea is much better able to focus on serving the star, no doubt playing an instrumental role in undoing the final days, while his son kept vigil over Pandemonium and supporting Lahabrea in whatever ways he could. There, I hope you guys enjoyed that little lore dump. Now, armed with the knowledge of Lahabrea's backstory, we can begin to discuss his character. Let's start by describing his personality traits. Okay, so Lahabrea is well respected in the society of the ancients, which of course comes with being a convocation member, but I think more than any other convocation member we've seen, Lahabrea simply commands this certain level of respect and authority we really don't see from any other ancient figure. It isn't hard to see why. He follows his principles, he among them him doing anything in his power to better the lives of his brethren and to serve the star. Possibly more than anyone, Lahabrea truly captures that sort of an ideal you'd want from someone living in such a highly collectivist society as the ancients. In addition, he really embodies the spirit of a no-nonsense type of a guy. He's very straightforward, and has no issue confronting people and calling them out. He takes no bullshit, in other words. Structured and disciplined, he sets his mind on a task and gets shit done. Though he respects ancient customs and doesn't have an issue dealing with social norms, he tends to minimize pleasantries and celebrations, as he rather spend his energy on more relevant things. One key anecdote about this is that you never once see Lahabrea smiling in the entire storyline. They didn't even do the Emet-Selch thing where he smiled upon dissipating. Nah, Lahabrea simply dissipates with a straight face. I find it amusing that the storyline even draws attention to this, with Erichtonios himself saying that Lahabrea isn't capable of such warmth as smiling. Even though he still hated his father when he said that, that sentiment is still correct, funnily enough. He's also very much a black and white thinker and has this iron will. Once he's made a judgment and set his mind on a task, it's difficult to persuade him to change course. This can really be seen how much it took to have him change his opinion regarding nuking Pandemonium, requiring the party to prove to him that they should keep going, after we see Themis invoking his station as Elidibus. We know and understand that Lahabrea is a brilliant scientist due to his talents, but what really separates him from the likes of Athena and Hermes is that he's also ethical. He might come across as a bit cold and callous, but he does in fact have a very firm sense of what is just and acts solely in the interest of the star, being driven by compassion towards his people.
The needs of the many outweigh
the needs of the few.
or the one.
He may rarely show affection directly, but he never intentionally goes through with something if it involves harming people. If he has to take action, he aims to minimize the amount of damage done and citizens being put at risk, such as when he proposed shutting down Pandemonium upon finding out what was going on in there. Furthermore, he's easily able to challenge his prior views or suppositions regardless of his personal feelings. It's these traits, along with his work ethic and his selflessness, that when combined with his personal talents and unorthodox methods to get shit done, that make him such an accomplished scientist in the ancient world. To add, there's one line by Lahabrea I really like. "On my pride as a researcher, I am loath to repeat the same mistake twice. I would not see these events play out again, and so he must be extinguished." This one line really says a lot about Lahabrea's character and the public persona he invests a lot into, of being a successful scientist and being proud of it. Plus, the metaphor of extinguishing Hephaestus, since, you know, he's the god of fire and shares Lahabrea's affinity for wielding powerful fire magics. I love it. Another relevant line I want to comment on is when he says his fatal flaw is his need for control. This can very much happen with people who have such an analytical mind as Lahabrea. It especially makes sense in his case, as he was repressing a lot of emotion, you know, he was quite cold, therefore it's natural for someone like him to always want to remain in control. I also wanted to add something that Banri Oda said in a Korean live letter Q&A. The question was basically asking how old are the ancients relative to real-life people, and Mr. Oda gave a response specifying the ages of each of the major ancients, where he described Lahabrea as an old man. I think this is important to point out because they deliberately made Lahabrea someone who appears as incredibly old between the wrinkles and the greyness. In a society that seemingly doesn't age anywhere near the same speed as we do in the real world, and him being the sole ancient we ever see being this old, I think that really exemplifies his status as this incredibly wise old man. It's always refreshing to see actual old people in JRPGs, since typically anyone in their late 20s is considered incredibly old in these kinds of stories. And if you're in your 30s, then you're basically a dinosaur.
But at the same time, like I said, and me, you know, I'm 56 years old. Damn!
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Because it was a
Sorry,
thought. No, seriously. It was a thought. It was a thought, and I blurted it out. I did not mean it that way.
I'm fine.
Okay, but just understand I didn't mean it the way it came out.
Another thing where Lahabrea's blunt nature comes into play is through his spellcasting. Throughout the Pandemonium questline, we see Elidibus casting all sorts of fancy magics, such as utilizing an illusion spell to summon phantom warriors for the Warrior of Light. Likewise, Emet-Selch is seen doing all sorts of cool stuff with his little finger snap. Lahabrea, on the other hand... And this has got real. Oh my god!
Yeah,
he just fucking roasted her. Holy... Yeah, his spellcasting is a bit more direct and he tends to fix his issues in a more direct way. Now, him flinging fireballs is obviously thematic to his affinity towards fiery concepts, but I honestly think it fits his wider personality perfectly. Why bother with fancy magics when you can just fireball? After all, it solves issues quite nicely and does so in the shortest amount of time with the least amount of energy spent. If that's not Lahabrea, then I don't know what is. Even his spellcasting is peak efficiency. Or put another way, he really is the quintessential wizard player. He even fireballed himself.
Fireball!
Alright, that all covers what Lahabrea was like pre-sundering, aka before he went crazy and all that fun stuff. But let's dissect his character further, as Lahabrea does get his own little character arc in the Pandemonium story. Now, breaking down Lahabrea's character is really quite interesting, seeing as this guy has quite a few personas. Before we even met him, we get 3 conflicting views of him: the public figure that Themis and the other ancients speak fondly of, the image of an awful father that Erichtonios has of him, and the crazy Lahabrea we knew from 2.0.
That shit is crazy. I really don't like that guy.
Indeed, they really milk our perceived image of Lahabrea for the first half of the Pandemonium storyline. We know that the Ascian Lahabrea was an awful person, but we aren't sure what Lahabrea was like in the Ancients' time, so the writers play into this quite nicely, through Erichtonios in particular. He's someone who despises Lahabrea, which conflicts with Themis' and the rest of the Ancients' view of the man. This is brilliant because it captures the conflicting view the player may also have on the character, between the evil murder hobo Ascian and the potentially caring ancient. Furthermore, I love when stories do this, where they give you a perspective that is deliberately faulty to show a character in a bad light. Because yes, people in real life do this all the time, especially if they really hate a person, as they end up developing this image of them in their head that could be very far removed from reality. Through our conversations with Erichtonios, the player might get the impression that Lahabrea is the most awful person in existence, but it was all really just Erichtonios' own biased view, which comes under scrutiny whenever we hear other perspectives on Lahabrea. This also really reminds me of the Tidus and Jecht relationship from Final Fantasy X. When we finally do encounter Lahabrea, we see that he is indeed quite similar to his public persona. He has this no-nonsense attitude that I mentioned earlier, and he's also someone who values rational decision-making based on sound logic over sentimental thinking. This is further aided by him cutting his soul in half. Yes, one of the benefits of this soul split was that it made Lahabrea that much more effective at his work, since Lahabrea was already someone who was very fixated on his duty, and this basically served to amplify that part of him, or so it seems on the surface. When we initially meet him, there is something off about him. He's haunted by his unresolved past. Lahabrea views his young past self with immense shame. He saw himself as too ambitious, too driven by emotions such as his affection towards Athena, and someone who failed to uphold his duty to the star. So for him, an easy path to take was to resign everything he was and fully adopt his public image of Lahabrea, the Convocation member. This was a convenient solution, as he could then hide behind that mask to avoid ever having to confront who he was. As a result, Lahabrea is described as someone who sort of prefers cold, hard logic over emotion. There are 2 reasons for this. One is that by attempting to shut down his emotions, he can avoid confronting what he was. The second reason is that when he purged half his soul, one of the many lasting effects on his psyche was a degree of emotional numbness. I believe, however, that Lahabrea in his current state would have always assumed this kind of a personality due to reason number 1, but that the soul purging probably made it worse. So when we finally meet him, we find out he's less of a someone who has mastery over their emotions and more as a someone who managed to suppress them for a time. Somewhat similar to people in real life who think they can simply bottle up their emotions, if you know what I mean. Anyway, what's funny about Lahabrea is that he took this idea of suppressing past trauma to the point that he even tried to literally remove the more emotional side of his soul. But you'd be a fool to think that someone can simply bury their emotions. It's just a facade. In truth, Lahabrea couldn't be further from a true stoic. Consider this, if he had even a tiny bit of emotional intelligence, he wouldn't be such a shitty father in the first place. I mean, damn, even the Warrior of Light calls his little temper tantrum childish. I also want to add that I don't think his decision to destroy Pandemonium is based purely on logic either, as he would have us believe. I mean, if you were in that position, would you not be inclined to raise this shit to the ground for no other reason than it existing giving you a lot of pain and serving to remind you of your failures? So as the story progresses, he regains his emotional intelligence as he develops his bond with Erichtonios, as he learns to love his son in a healthier way. So by the time Lahabrea has went through his character arc, we have a guy who can now wield his emotions to great effect rather than hide from them as he had done prior. A prime example is when he's addressing Hephaestus. He's really delivering a verbal ass-kicking on his other half. Those lines are straight fire, as befits Lahabrea, I suppose.
Your life is nothing. You serve zero purpose. You should kill yourself now. What are you here for? To worship me? Kill yourself.
They then, not so subtly, symbolize Lahabrea's growth in his final scene, where he invokes the Constellation Crystal in order to merge with Hephaestus' memories and become whole again, having fully conquered his past self. We understand that this is the true Lahabrea, his true nature. We can also see how this Lahabrea could eventually become the one we deal with in the MSQ, but I have an entire segment discussing the relationship between him and the Warrior of Light, so I won't get further into that here. Now, since Lahabrea's relationship with his son was so crucial to his character growth, I think it's only fitting that the next part of the video will be all about the man's family. What makes Lahabrea such an unique character is that he's the only major ancient whose family we get to explore. Besides minor NPCs in side quests, such as the brother and sister in that one LP side quest chain, we never really get to see familial relations between the relevant ancients we encounter in the story. As such, getting to experience some ancient family drama is very welcome. As some of you may have noticed from both my Alphino and my Tancred videos, I enjoy analyzing dads in Final Fantasy. This is because in the FF titles and in JRPGs in general, it's quite rare that the character's parents are ever brought up. In a sense, this is understandable. I mean, can you imagine if every character you meet in a game started opening up about their parents? The game would have pages upon pages of dialogue of nothing but family drama. But this means that whenever we do get insight into a character's family, it hits like a rare treat for me. What can I say, parenting is an area of psychology that I just find really interesting. So, what is the story behind Lahabrea's family? Let's analyze that in this segment. Now, Lahabrea is an ancient, and as we all know, the ancients tend to have heartwarming stories that are simply full of rainbows and delight, free of tragedy and living happily ever after. So it is for Lahabrea. He has a beautiful wife, a son who owns a factory, and they have lobsters for dinner. It's awesome. Joking aside, here's a quick introduction to Lahabrea's actual family. We have Athena, a mom literally possessed by a devil, gave birth to a child so that she could assimilate with him to become God. Lahabrea, the husband, who created a creepy dungeon for the sole purpose of locking his wife up in there, then proceeded to kill her over a child custody dispute. In addition, he prioritized creating birds over raising his son. I mean, what is it with these ancients and creating birds? I don't get it. Anyway, all that sounds pretty horrid, but on a more positive note, he did manage to find a way to purge all memories of his wife, a brilliant technique every husband would know. A brilliant technique every husband would be eager to learn. And finally, their son, Erichtonios. Well, I say their son, but he actually received more parenting by Themis and the warrior flight during their 5 minutes visiting the aforementioned creepy dungeon than from either of his biological parents, or whatever the equivalent of a biological parent is in the ancient society. Come to think of it, Athena was historically a virgin, and it's a bit hard to picture Lahabrea doing the act. Let's say that's a topic for another video. So yes, the Pandemonium story is basically seeing Erichtonios deal with both daddy and mommy issues, Themis being a cool and encouraging sibling to Erichtonios, Lahabrea trying to be a good father, and Athena being an absolute piece of shit all the way through. But of course, that's just a broad overview. Let's get a bit into the specifics here, starting with the relationship between father and son. Will Lahabrea win the Father of the Year award? Keep watching to find out. So, a central theme of the Pandemonium story is Lahabrea's and Erichtonios' relationship. Was he a good father? Was he a bad father? I think Claudian sums up their relationship excellently at the end of the story. Through unyielding discipline, you hope to forge a son equal to yourself, but the crucible you placed him in left scars which were loath to heal. Yet you were never motivated by selfishness. All you did was in service of your duty. Lahabrea is an interesting case because the writers ultimately had very little to work with as far as his post-sundering self. There really wasn't much to his character, he was just kind of a madman, but there was one thing they could focus on and hone that into something more tangible later. The fact that Lahabrea acted as sort of a face for the Ascians and was always very active in furthering their goals and embodied the design of the Ascians. He was basically the most Ascian there ever was. This then allowed them to create someone who was very much the opposite of Lahabrea, which then resulted in Emet-Selch. Whereas Emet-Selch was someone who had this very tired demeanor all throughout the story, signifying him being exhausted by the burden he's had to carry, Lahabrea was someone who went all out, always on the move and trying to stir something.
Not that my compeers would agree, mind you, always on the move, the lot of them. Like Lahabrea, constantly jumping from vessel to vessel. Such fire, such determination. So much passion, fleeting and forgotten.
But of course, that kind of a thing takes a toll on you eventually. And so, Shadowbringers came to the rescue and we had Emet-Selch allude to this side of Lahabrea on 3 occasions. Once through the MSQ, once through optional dialogue, and once in a side story. This then gave an excellent building block for Lahabrea's character in the Pandemonium storyline.
But it's because Lahabrea did quite a lot of work, and he was like a workaholic. Same kind of goes to Yoshida. He's really, he works a lot, so in the case, he works like crazy, so they share some similar meaning there.
Don't call him crazy, right?
And so the theme behind his character became Lahabrea the Workaholic, hence the title of this video. Because this one word really informs all that is Lahabrea's character, down to his core personality and the relationship between him and Erichtonios. He's essentially that person who works over 100 hours a week, completely consumed by work. It's little wonder he didn't have time to raise Erichtonios. Indeed, in their relationship, we see pretty common psychological effects of a workaholic parent. Lahabrea wanted to make a son equal to himself through unyielding discipline, something motivated by tough love and his selflessness, and his devotion to his duty. But despite his intentions, all this resulted in really was a child who craves his parents' attention and approval, but finds himself unable to measure to his father's standard. This is common behavior within children of workaholics. They easily become people pleasers to try and win the approval of the parent, and this is a feature we see prominently in Erichtonios. He's very codependent, much in contrast to his father. Likewise, Lahabrea's growth has him dealing with the issue that all workaholics face at some point. Their accomplishment might be great, their work might be rewarding, and their work might even be appreciated by the wider world, all boxes which Lahabrea certainly ticks, but what happens when you make it your entire identity and who you are? And how badly will you impose suffering on not just yourself, but to all those close to you. This is the problem Lahabrea has to face, which he eventually overcomes by balancing out that identity with that of simply being a caring father. In this sense, it makes for a very satisfying story to see these two evolve as individuals as well as develop their bond between each other. Granted, this is a pretty common trope in movies. The whole a parent, usually a dad, working all day and doesn't have time for their kids, realizing at the end of the movie that their family is what's most important. Yeah, you know which kind of a movie I'm talking about. Now, you might be saying that you never got that vibe from this storyline, and that would be fair because the reason the Pandemonium story doesn't feel like those cheesy, generic movies about workaholic parents is because they managed to avoid the pitfalls that these movies usually fall into, the ones people criticize them the most about. In that sense, by examining the story between Lahabrea and Erichtonios, we can better understand how to write these stories properly. For starters, usually the way the child is handled in these movies is to make them incredibly whiny, entitled, and obnoxious, and that's pretty much their entire role in the movie. They are a one-dimensional caricature, in other words, rather than a true fleshed-out character. While Eric does start out a bit whiny, as he's pretty often either doubting himself or talking about his daddy issues, the important thing is that he doesn't remain that way, and there's more to his character, like his compassion towards the scientists and creations of Pandemonium. But yes, he does start out at very low confidence, but throughout Asphodelos and Abyssos, he goes on a journey towards becoming more brave, encouraged by his allies. So, thanks to the efforts of Themis and the Warrior of Light, Erichtonios slowly gains confidence and becomes more resolved as the story progresses. In addition, he's never really a burden since he's often helping you directly by bringing vital information that allows Themis and the Warrior of Light to prevail, as well as being the one who enters the creations and keywords, albeit with the help of the Warrior of Light, who first has to beat the crap out of them, and Themis, who gives the necessary ether to fuel his interment spell. But hey, it's a team effort, and Erichtonios certainly plays an important role in this team. So it's through this journey that Erichtonios is then forged into that kind of a son Lahabrea failed to raise in his youth, and one he could be proud of. Furthermore, while Lahabrea most definitely appreciates Erichtonios for how bold he's become, as he puts it, I also think he's able to recognize how compassionate his son is, through him wanting to save the creations and the keywords. This is in stark contrast to himself, since he wanted to destroy the place, and he later acknowledges that doing it his way would have been a mistake. I got the sense that Lahabrea admires that compassion within his son. All of this is to say, Erichtonios doesn't just gain Lahabrea's approval by existing, he actually earns his father's respect. He grows concurrently with Lahabrea realizing he was at fault and could have been a better father all along. It would have been all too easy to simply have the story focus solely on Lahabrea's turnaround, but they put in the effort to flesh out both sides of the relationship, which is great, and not many writers would have done that, so props to them. Just imagine if Erichtonios had instead seen this stuff happening in Pandemonium, and then said, screw this, and then went home to binge anime, watch porn and play games all day, then why would Lahabrea give him the recognition he craved? Instead of being all like, I'm proud of you, son, he'd be well within his rights to just say, son, you are a fucking degenerate, and then walk off to the store to buy some cigarettes. You might say I'm pounding this point in way too hard unnecessarily, but I feel it's important because this is something so many writers get wrong. Respect isn't something that is simply given, it has to be earned, and these relationships gotta show both sides. Another important thing is that Lahabrea's workaholism isn't treated as purely a flaw of his character, something he must cast out because, oh no, he's a bad parent because he just happens to be dedicated to his work, and damn good at it too. In a lot of fiction, workaholism is treated in this very black and white way, where the parent has to show up to every single event the child has, or they're awful. So I appreciate that when Lahabrea it's handled with more subtlety. It's also important to note that even after learning to love and respect his son more, he still retains that part of his personality. It doesn't go away, it's more just that he learns to acknowledge and appreciate his son while doing it. This is also important because Erichtonios too understands this. Instead of trying to change his father, he acknowledges that this is who Lahabrea is, someone who's going to dedicate himself to his work and for the star. Instead of whining about it and wanting him to change, he accepts his father as he is and shows compassion towards him. For those of you who watched my Alphino video, you may recall I said much the same when it came to Fortunal. When people have grown up to be a certain way, it's damn near impossible to completely change their worldview, but you can come to a compromise and an understanding in spite of it. That's why I love the resolution with Lahabrea and Erichtonios. So many writers would have been tempted to have Lahabrea do a complete 180 at the end, being all like, "Oh my son, I now realize you're all that mattered at the end. I will quit the convocation and focus all my life on raising you now," or some such rubbish. People simply do not work like that. What we get instead is a Lahabrea that still holds much the same worldview. It's simply that he learned to love his son in a more caring way than when he started out. That's his character arc. And likewise, Erichtonios being able to appreciate his father for who he really is and supporting him. And a crucial element here as well is that Lahabrea lets him come to his own conclusions instead of pressuring him into thinking the way he wants his son to see him as. I do want to clarify though that yes, workaholism does negatively affect the individual and those around, and its psychological effects are well known, but I mean to say that simply being that disciplined and having that kind of a work ethic isn't bad in itself. You just have to make it so that it's not all there is to your existence. By bonding with his son, Lahabrea is able to temper his workaholism so it becomes healthy, and thus goes from workaholism to someone who is both damn good at his job while also maintaining a healthy relationship with his family. In summary, whoever wrote this story really understood how to make a meaningful relationship between a workaholic and a child. They did an awesome job, so I just wanted to show some appreciation. The truth is, of course, that Lahabrea always cared for his son. It's just that due to the aforementioned circumstances, he struggled to show it. Just imagine the awful burden that Lahabrea had to bear in regards to Eric's mom being such an awful person and being forced to kill her, not just to save many lives, but the life of his son. And we could of course ponder if we had arrived at the same conclusion. Would we have tried hiding it as he did? It's easy to judge as an outsider, but then again, what would you have done? Especially for those of you who might be parents, it would probably be a pretty awful conundrum. And even if you entertained the idea of telling, would you have been able to actually go through with it? As in having the courage to do so. I should also note that following him purging half his soul, Lahabrea had even less time for his son. Well, I say less time when in reality he had none really. The timing of Lahabrea killing Athena and the whole soul-splitting business really was unfortunate for Erichtonios. As a result, he would pretty much be raised by the words of Lahabrea. What also probably complicated their relationship further was the aforementioned emotional numbness that Lahabrea was experiencing. It's important to note, however, that the game kinda gives proof that while this certainly didn't make their relationship any easier, it was still possible for them to form a healthy bond regardless. After all, Lahabrea does mend his relationship with Erichtonios while still being only half a soul, and we see the affection shared between them remaining the same even after Lahabrea combined his soul again, but it may have nevertheless played a role in worsening their relationship initially. As a side note, I can't help but see the particular point about Lahabrea allowing his son to be raised by the words, to be inspired by Japanese society, with Japan having a huge issue with parents giving up their child to foster care, with neglect being the factor a vast majority of the time, and with the parents never allowing these children to be adopted. So naturally, since their relationship is so cold, when the two finally reunite, they have this rather bitter exchange. Feelings towards the other that have been bottled up sort of just come out, and Erichtonios is corrupted by Hephaestus as a result. Lahabrea feels genuine remorse and starts to consider if the way he cares about his son is flawed. He eventually comes to realize he had been taking the wrong approach and changes the way he views his son, becoming a much more loving parent to Erichtonios in the process. The culmination of all of this is of course following Hephaestus' defeat, when it finally comes time for Erichtonios to make that choice. Does he reconcile or hate his father forever? I must say though, that scene is so hype. The way Lahabrea destroys his past self from having realized the bad parent he had been, topped with some really badass lines. Then we follow right into the team up between father and son to contain Hephaestus. It's so symbolic, it's funny, them overcoming their feelings towards that past Lahabrea together. And the icing on the cake when they reconcile at the end, with Lahabrea acknowledging Erichtonios' growth and Erichtonios showing gratitude towards Lahabrea for being there for him and being a great father. Yeah, I admit I teared up when I was rewatching this scene. We get to enjoy a similarly wholesome moment between them after you defeat Athena. Before Erichtonios is about to destroy Athena, Lahabrea takes a moment to consider what to say. I love the expression he makes here. It's as if he's thinking of the most logical thing to say, but then realizes, screw it, and speaks purely from the heart. Do as you will, my son. I know you shall make me proud. I mean, they pretty much built up the relationship between them the entire storyline, all in order to drop that one line at the end. It's awesome. Man, he's even being wholesome with Claudian, reminding him that he's his own person and not his son. This is such a funny contrast to Emet. He doesn't, or at least this specific version of Lahabrea, doesn't see the sundered people as inferior versions of the actual souls they take after, but as their own individuals. And they really pulled all the stops when it came to making Lahabrea out to be this wholesome father. They even slam in both the lines, "You did well, son," and "You make me proud." Yeah, they're pretty cliched expressions, but I definitely felt it both times he said those lines. It was great.
I just love the fact that, you know, in a sense, like, well, unless he comes back now or something, I don't know, but as far as we're aware, his final words to his son was that he makes him proud. He makes him proud. Damn. Oh, I love that.
All the time.
Wait, do you have any gum?
What'd you say?
Sorry.
I'm all eyes. I mean ears.
Alright lads, let's now move on to talking about the final member of the Lahabrea household, Athena. Right away, something I love about the design of this character is that she's the first ancient we've seen who doesn't have this sympathetic background to her. She's just plain evil, and I think that's cool.
What the hell?
What?
Oh, it's her! It's Athena. Damn, this bit's crazy.
She wants to be God. Here we go. Time to kill God again, guys. In a JRPG.
Yeah. Get in line, lady. We've been killing a lot of gods lately, so... It's like... Do you want to become a god when the warrior of light is standing next to you? Like, are you sure about that?
Not very wise.
They knew we already had the sympathetic enemy in the form of Lahabrea and didn't want to saturate the story with any more of them, so they did the smart choice and instead made Athena an irredeemable scumbag of an antagonist. Furthermore, I think Athena is the perfect villain for this story from a thematic point of view. A core theme in the Pandemonium story is familial love, particularly between parent and child. It is then fitting to have the bad guy of the story represent what an absolutely awful and narcissistic parent would look like. She really embodies that garbage parent like no other, like they really tried pulling all the features they could when it comes to your typical narcissistic parent. The control element, manipulation, prioritizing their own needs over that of the child's, taking advantage of everyone else for their personal benefit, low empathy or lack thereof, and so many more. Yep, they got the full recipe, alright. Narcissists don't form relationships, they take prisoners. This description has always stuck out to me, and though it's completely uncoincidental, I do find it amusing that Athena operates from a prison. I just felt like sharing that. What's also interesting is that when Athena says she created Erichtonios so that he would have this desire to follow his mother, it's not explicitly made clear whether this is achieved through magic, via some sort of an enchantment on Eric's soul, or simply through manipulation. What I can say, however, is that what Athena did to Erichtonios is a very real thing. It's called infantilization. Now, infantilization can occur by accident, but it can also be done on purpose. A narcissistic parent has a lot to gain from infantilizing their child. It gives them a sense of power to have someone rely on them so much, but more importantly, it gives them the control they need over their children. One of the hardest hitting lines comes from her theme song, where she literally tells Erichtonios that never once were you truly alive. I mean, wow, that's a brutal line and really encapsulates Athena in a single sentence. I think having a character like Athena every once in a while serves as a good reminder that not all parents are saints that would do anything for their children. Parents like her do exist, and the sad reality is that there are a ton of them. For really narcissistic people, they are incapable of putting their children's need ahead of their own because for them, they still care about themselves far more than anything else. So just remember, there might be more Athenas out there than you realize. Just without the whole wanting to become a god thing, of course. Athena also has a very good ending with how it brings perfect closure to her and Erichtonios' relationship. A big part of Erichtonios' story has been him trying to basically detach himself from Athena's influence, so it's very fitting that his final act is to destroy the very thing, the very monster that has been controlling him all along. Similar to that Hephaestus scene, where he goes, "I'll have my say," and breaks free from his binds after learning and accepting the truth about Athena. It comes full circle here. He's making sure that he meets his end on his own terms, not on the terms of a self-centered parent that has tried to manipulate him all his life. Their exchange at the end is also brilliantly written. I like this so much, with Athena taunting him one last time out of pure spite, and Erichtonios firing back with a burn hotter than Lahabrea's fireball. And who made me that way? Such an awesome line to cap off Eric's character with, really showing his growth and such a chat response, one befitting someone who's broken his shackles. Another reason I really like this line is that there's a bittersweet connotation to it too. Erichtonios is lamenting that he was created for that sole purpose of being manipulated by Athena, and he lived most of his life in that ignorance, under that fake world she created for him. Despite the W of Erichtonios and his friends bringing her evil schemes to an end, and him breaking her hold over him in the end, she still succeeded in ruining most of his life, which is quite tragic in its own right. Even if that line has a bittersweet connotation to it, I still think it's overall a W for Erichtonios. Now, another purpose Athena serves in the story is that she, along with Hephaestus, are meant to be foils to Lahabrea. In many respects, Athena is essentially the opposite of Lahabrea as a parent. Lahabrea appears to be a rough parent on the inside, but bears a lot of love for his son on the inside. Athena, however, appears to be a good parent on the outside, but an awful one on the inside, which by the way is a very common tactic among narcissistic parents, but moving on. Similarly, Lahabrea's love was distant but pure, while Athena's love, in quotations, was intimate but twisted. Put another way, Lahabrea's work was one of compassion, but did not involve his son, only indirectly I suppose, while Athena's work was one of sadism, but did involve her son in a direct way. In essence, Athena represents what we thought of Lahabrea all along, an awful parent, ruthless and doing anything to achieve their goals. Of course, until they flipped that on its head towards the end of Abyssos. Yet there were also similarities between the two. The most notable one is the one that Lahabrea himself mentions. They both had this innate need for control, which blinded them to other perspectives. But this trait manifested in Hephaestus, and through him, Lahabrea was able to recognize it as a flaw and cut back on it to mend the relationship with his son. In a sense, having his worst qualities manifest themselves was the best thing that happened in their relationship, funnily enough. What easier way to recognize your flaws and then iron them out than to literally see them manifest in a mirror image of yourself and then defeating that mirror image. With Athena, the story poses this question of how much of her actions were caused by the stone's corrupting influence and how much of it was her. Now, this gets more interesting if we then extend that line of thinking onto Lahabrea. In this way, we can ask, how much of Hephaestus is Lahabrea? I think the story gives a pretty clear answer though, as it's pretty on the nose with the Jungian shadow self concept, pretty much alluding to Hephaestus simply being Lahabrea's less desirable traits: greed, envy and desire. I mentioned the shadow self concept being a bit on the nose, but I suppose it could likewise be easy to overlook that one tiny bit of dialogue amidst the sea of dialogue, so apologies if I came across as a bit of a dickhead when I said that. Nevertheless, the particular flavor they chose for Lahabrea's shadow makes it interesting enough to where I want to discuss it. Oh yes, we are going to have an entire segment on the Jungian shadow, because when I get an opportunity to talk about this, ain't nobody stopping me. Now, as with all fantasy stories, despite all the supernatural aspects, ultimately it still boils down to something very primitive, some kind of a core part of the human experience. In the case of Pandemonium, or one part of the story I should say, is about telling the story of Lahabrea overcoming his shadow. It's a psychological battle that takes place within the mind. However, it's presented in a more abstract way because the game is titled Final Fantasy, and, well, it wouldn't be Final Fantasy if we didn't fight a few gods and demons along the way, now would it? So let us first establish the persona and the shadow, if you will. Firstly, we have Lahabrea, the public persona. This is basically what he wants to project to the rest of the world. An accomplished scientist, disciplined, mind over matter, calm, and doesn't let emotions get in his way. Lahabrea is utterly selfless, does anything for the sake of the star, and puts the safety and well-being of his people well above everything else. Contrasted to this, we have Hephaestus, who represents his shadow. Hephaestus embodies those emotions/traits we really don't want to see in ourselves. Avarice, jealousy, temptation, that kind of stuff. He's also extremely selfish and only cares about fulfilling his ambitions, even if it should come at the cost of harming others, very much a the ends justify the means type. This is much in contrast to what a Convocation member stands for and what Lahabrea himself stands for. That's why he loathes that part of him and doesn't want to confront it, and instead chooses to perceive these traits as weakness. This is why he seals Hephaestus within the crystal, an act that is analogous to running from one's shadow. In this way, Lahabrea tries his hardest to suppress Hephaestus, to deny that this thing could be a part of him. But like I said earlier in this analysis, you'd be a fool to think you could simply repress those kinds of emotions. These kinds of passions, even darker ones that Hephaestus embodies, are an intrinsic part of human nature. No matter how hard you wail against it, they will always be a part of you. Indeed, by bottling up those feelings, they will eventually come out and you will have lost control, and bad things may happen as a result. When Hephaestus broke free and wreaked havoc within the halls of Pandemonium, I saw that as symbolic for Lahabrea having lost control of those feelings. He tried to contain the shadow, but it inevitably broke free. So in order to control the shadow, Lahabrea has to accept that it's there and to allow it to be a part of him. This happens in two stages. The first one is after confronting Hephaestus, when he acknowledges that those traits, though undesirable, have merit to them, such as Hephaestus performing his duty as a husband and a father should, as well as realizing the similarities between him and Hephaestus, the main one being their stubbornness that often caused them to overlook other angles. Then, after thinking about it long and hard, mixed in with some hesitation to act, he finally makes the decision to merge with Hephaestus' memory stored within the crystal, thus embracing his shadow, and accepts Hephaestus as part of him.
Together. It's time to find out who we are. Once and for all.
It's a very cool scene with how they show this reunion manifest through his half-broken Ascian glyph becoming whole again, with the roasting of Hegemone, and it's nicely capped off with this line by Demis afterwards. Hephaestus and Lahabrea were one and the same when he was named as one of the Convocation. This change poses no need for concern, for all is as it should be. Basically reaffirming to us one final time, this is the true Lahabrea. It's interesting that Lahabrea himself even says that, if not for events playing out in this way, he would have never been forced to reconsider his true nature. Forced is an interesting word of choice because I would imagine it's very uncommon within the ancient society to ever think of these kinds of things. It also harkens back to Lahabrea's comment about how his need for control blinded him from other perspectives. So the only reason Lahabrea was able to go through with this kind of introspection was because of an outsider's perspective, that being the warrior of light and being willing to listen to said perspective. If not for you, my long slumbering demons may have gone unslain. I would have never been forced to reconsider my true nature. The icing on the cake, the bonus third stage of him accepting his shadow, is when he's confronted with the truth of what his Ascian self had done post-sundering, and he fully accepts that by saying, yes, I could have done those things. Just that one final bit of reinforcement of him having fully vanquished his shadow, that even after his character had been shaped by millennia of tragedy, he was still steadfast about accepting that this is who he is. It really makes the whole thing come full circle. It's also interesting to me that the way Lahabrea tried to detach himself from his shadow self was to commit ego death. In the Society of the Ancients, by default the convocation members are addressed by their title and no longer by their actual name. The significance behind this is that your name is the single biggest expression of your core identity, but for the convocation members, they are seen as the de facto representatives of their society, to the point that it is expected they essentially shed that little bit of individuality that was allowed them in an otherwise collectivist society. So by distancing yourself from your identity, you become something greater. Your duty, the name of your office, now defines you, not your identity. You stop being Hephaestus and you simply become Lahabrea. Lahabrea takes this already extreme thing and takes it one step further still by completely severing his identity from himself when he splits his soul, thereby committing ego death. We then get to see the consequences of this. He becomes a lot more apathetic and he struggles to love the people that matter to him, such as his son. By removing his shadow self, he simultaneously removed a core aspect that makes us human, therefore ridding him of his humanity, which is quite ironic for a storyline where the bad guy is trying to ascend and become a god. What I love about this is that we see that this doesn't make him stronger. The opposite, in fact, it makes him weaker, not just spiritually, but in terms of his actual power levels, because he'd lost his humanity, those passions that drive us and make us stronger. Lahabrea's story poses a question of what would happen if you try to get rid of your shadow self by committing ego death? And the answer we get is, well, it makes you weaker, because it is not until he merges with Hephaestus that he becomes strong again, both spiritually and in terms of his spellcasting. I also wanted to add that whoever made the decision to have Lahabrea's story be all about him overcoming his shadow is a freaking genius and needs a raise, because I think that's some real 200 IQ play right there. Think about what Natsuko Ishikawa said about the original design of the Ascians. Back in 1.0 it was said about the Ascians, they are paranormal entities that are planning something, they have no shadows. But back then other characters' shadows also didn't display, so the Ascian special feature was done away with, and so after that they were rebuilt into a group of bad guys. In other words, they wanted the Ascians to be these beings who had no shadows. Their team is even called Shadows with Tongue. Remember how I said that Lahabrea represents the original design of the Ascians? Therefore, his story being about vanquishing the shadow is just perfect. It's awesome, man, what else can I say? All in all, I'd say Lahabrea's depiction of the shadow self makes for a fine addition to the collection of stories that utilize this concept. That is to say, I'm not oblivious to the fact that the shadow self idea is a very common trope within JRPGs. Persona definitely comes to mind as being a very popular game series that uses it, which is funny since I'm pretty sure this is meant to be a Persona reference.
I am become you.
And we are become one.
But this idea is used in quite a lot of JRPGs. Even FF16 had it, to feature an example that is very recent. And honestly, not just JRPGs, I would prefer it's simply an interesting topic to handle in any narrative in general, because it's a very humane concept and an interesting bit of psychology. But I bring this up to say that even though it's used quite a lot, I still like the unique way in which they approach this with Lahabrea's character. So now that we've thoroughly discussed Lahabrea in the time of the Ancients, we can circle this all the way back around and once more discuss Lahabrea, the Ascian, in an effort to perhaps piece together what became of the man once the world was sundered. Alright, so first a very quick half-a-minute summary of Lahabrea's story post-sundering. Hydaelyn kicks and Lahabrea is saved because he happened to be in Emet's proximity when this happened. He becomes an Ascian, works to cause calamities in order to make Zodiac whole and bring back their world. He uses the Heart of Sabik in the Praetorium to cast Ultima, is eventually killed by Torden in ARF. A memory version of him from the Ancients' time is brought back by Athena. He helps the Warrior of Light and the others to undo Athena's schemes once and for all, after which he dissipates. Boom! Told you it's a quick summary, to the point, much like Lahabrea himself. Now, since this video is about an ancient, we of course cannot avoid talking about the traumatic experience that was the Sundering. In that regard, Lahabrea's case is rather unique, seeing as he was already dead by the time Shadowbringers gave the other two unsundered their sympathetic treatment, and so we never got any kind of closure on how the Sundering affected him. All of that was done in retrospect. While this is unfortunate, the writers roll with it and even use it to their advantage. Indeed, in the Anabaseus part of the Pandemonium story, the last year of the Raid series, a great emphasis is put on contrasting the ancient Lahabrea with the Ascian Lahabrea that he would eventually become. The story makes it pretty open up to the player's interpretation as to how Lahabrea became that kind of a person, and more importantly, how much of that Lahabrea we got to know during the Pandemonium story, the ancient, how much of him is in that Ascian Lahabrea. I think for most people the answer is a little nuanced, rather than a straight up, oh, he was evil all along or whatnot.
Long, long ago, in an age now past, this star was as paradise.
Luckily, the writers themselves provide a really great viewpoint about it. In my Emet-Selch video, I brought up the Near Reincarnation crossover and how it sort of added a tiny bit of flavor on the already phenomenal story behind Emet-Selch. Well, it's true that the crossover does heavily focus on Emet in particular, however, they brought back the FF14 crossover event on June 8th, and since this meant the event took place after the Pandemonium story had concluded, they cleverly took the opportunity to feature a bit of Lahabrea in there as well. I want to discuss what it says on the Hades EX monk weapon, Zelos in particular. Time weathers the heart. The strongest wishes and anxieties wear away over centuries and fade over eons. Thus did an ancient spellcaster give form to feeling, turning his passion into a weapon. Two men, great spellcasters, were the only ones left after the battle that shattered the world. They vowed to repair what had been lost and bring back their lost children, friends and loved ones, even if it should take millennia. One man had broken his own heart and, knowing this pain, decided he did not wish to lose it further, but the more he poured his passion into his mission, the more his heart blackened and warped. As the other watched his friend turn martyr, he decided to preserve himself to accomplish their mission, even if it meant cutting off a piece of his own heart, so passion did not burn it to ash. Now, this description doesn't necessarily give us some kind of a new revelation about Lahabrea's story. However, I wanted to bring it up because I think it does an excellent job at putting into words Lahabrea's experience post-sundering. Earlier in the video, I talked about how Lahabrea had lost a part of his humanity through his soul-splitting process, which here is framed as him breaking his own heart, a metaphor that I really like. But it then adds that he did not want to further lose his humanity, and that tragically, the more passionate he was about his duty, the more his heart grew black. I love this because this really recontextualizes Lahabrea's story post-sundering by adding a very tragic and humane element to it. Notice how it specifically says, bring back their lost children, friends and loved ones. See, usually when the Ascians talk about bringing back the ancients, they talk about their brethren, their people, or some such, but here it specifically says children. And unless Emet-Selch had a child in secret with Hythlo and or Azem that we don't know about, well, we know whom this refers to. Yes, all along it was Lahabrea's love for his son and wanting to get him back that drove his passion for trying to restore the world. He desperately tried to cling to his humanity, his heart if you will, through his love for Erichtonios. But as he worked harder and harder, this fiery fervor would slowly turn into a guttering flame and then into ash. Was this because of the corrupting influence of the aura site, or the shadow slowly taking over again, or just plain old burnout, just applied on a much grander scale? Well, that's up to the reader's interpretation, I should think, or you could even say it was all three factors that applied here. But whatever the case, it repaints Lahabrea as this very tragic character who tried doing the wrong things for the right reasons, and him weaponizing his own humanity to bring back his loved one, which then backfired as the path he set out was simply too painful, too arduous for any single soul to walk. This also quite nicely cements the contrast between Emet and Lahabrea that I had brought up towards the beginning of the video. In the final paragraph, it talks about how Emet-Selch saw this mental degradation take hold of Lahabrea, and in an effort to not share his tragic fate, took the complete opposite approach. As they eloquently put it, he cut off a piece of his own heart. Hence adding yet another layer on why Emet-Selch is so tired of everything by the time we encounter him in the story, and I also like this angle being taken when considering the relationship between him and the Warrior of Light. I think him deliberately trying to suppress his passion maybe adds further richness as to why he struggles so hard with his feelings on the Warrior of Light's resemblance of Azem, and why he's so adamant on refusing to see them as his old friend equal, instead of seeing the Warrior of Light as their own distinct person, and why, when he's summoned in Ultima Thule, he's able to let go of all that, because his burden has now been lifted. He now has no more reason to resist those feelings, and so he finally acknowledges the Warrior of Light's merit as their own person, and even gives that little nod about them being Azem's successor. But let me further elaborate on Lahabrea's Ascian life, and what led to his eventual demise. Let's consider that he's not only had to deal with the trauma of the Sundering, but we also aren't quite sure if he fully overcame his split personality thing, and there was of course Athena's memories further corrupting him through the heart of Sabik. I would imagine that over time, the Hephaestus side of his personality took over more and more. By the time the game starts, we can really see his completely unhinged personality. Unlike Emet-Selch, who subjects the sundered people to a triumph, and Elidibus, who sometimes opposes and sometimes stands together with his Ascian brethren, Lahabrea treats everyone and everything as mere tools. Fittingly as well, his end came much the same way as Hephaestus and Athena's. His arrogance and thinking he had full control over people. As Thornton put it, he was certain they would meekly serve as his pawns.
My Ascian friend, long have you and your kind sown the seeds of chaos by teaching mortals the secrets of summoning. But if you assumed that we would meekly serve as your pawns, then you are gravely mistaken.
A grave mistake that did cost him his life. As an Ascian, Lahabrea was of course as dedicated to his duty as the other two, if not more so. Something that differs between the three Unsundered, however, are their motives. They were all bound by the same duty and had the same modus operandi, but why they were doing it differed slightly. While Emet-Selch did what he did out of love for his brethren, and Elidibus' mission was to be mankind's salvation, for Lahabrea he did what he did out of sheer obligation for the star. Besides their motives, another distinction between them was how fulfilling their duties took a toll on each of them. For Emet-Selch, his mind deteriorated because his mind struggled to handle the burden and the grief he felt. For Elidibus, His mind took a great toll due to him forgetting. For Lahabrea, it seemed to have been more of a case of essentially working himself to a point of exhaustion. And Lahabrea's characterization in Pandemonium does an excellent job at allowing us to recontextualize his downfall. If we have someone so dedicated to his duty to do what he deems best for the star, and an avid workaholic such as Lahabrea, and then you hand him such an enormous task as making Zodiac and the world whole again, I mean, he's going to take that task in earnest, but no soul could withstand something like that for that long a period. Another note on Emet-Selch, we can see in the side story just how fond he was of Lahabrea and how his death affected him. He also laments what Lahabrea turned into over the years. It really helps sell even further, if that was ever necessary, how Emmet became so damn depressed and tired of everything. Having to watch two of your close friends turn insane over the years, unable to do anything about it, it's pretty awful.
Such fire, such determination, so much passion fleeting and forgotten.
Speaking of side stories, in November 2024, they released a side story from the Tales Under the New Moon series called Whispers from the Dark. What makes this side story quite unique is that it is the only instance where we get a glimpse into the inner thoughts of Lahabrea post-sundering. In the MSQ, he projects this image of this absolute crazy person who is willing to do anything, but in the side story we see a person who is haunted by these memories of the past. He's trying so hard to recall his family and even who he himself was. He's trying to connect the dots, which only serves to drive him nuts. It's like there's a small part of him that's still in there that is trying to find his humanity, but it is eclipsed by all the trauma he's had to face. So he carries on because, well, that is the question, isn't it? What even motivates Lahabrea at this stage? Does he genuinely retain the view that this is the best way for the star to achieve peace, as he put it? Or is it sunk cost fallacy? Has his work consumed him so much that he's merely going through the motions at this point? It's a little hard to say because his character is so lost at this point in the story. His mind is so fractured that trying to piece together his true motivation is a little difficult. But I personally think that he's robotically going through the calamities because it's the only thing he can do to occupy himself and not have to think about things, which is emblematic of a true workaholic. The work becomes an addiction and almost a defense mechanism of sorts, because if you keep working and working, you won't have to confront your problems. It's quite sad when you think about it.
Sad, isn't it?
Luckily, Lahabrea does end up getting closure just like the other two. He appears with his memories from the world unsundered and plays an instrumental role in finally putting an end to Athena's schemes by being the one to tell Erichtonios on how he could defeat her. Though he laments the actions of his Ascian self and is appalled at the lengths they went to, he fully admits that he can definitely see himself doing those things for the sake of the star and his duty. He further laments how he would end up using the heart of Sabik, fully ignorant of its true nature, and how that put his hypocrisy on full display. But to be fair to our boy here, hypocrisy seems to be part and parcel for the Ancients. Like, based on these analysis videos, I've come to realize it's pretty much a defining feature of an Ancient at this point. But yes, good closure, even if technically his final scene is that really badass one, where he reclaims his form and roasts Hegemone. Following this, we could finally piece together how this Lahabrea could eventually become our enemy. He even says as much. I'm just gonna quote the journal for this one because it's so cool with how it's written. After absorbing those bitter memories, the change in his personality is immediately apparent. In him, you see the Lahabrea who will one day stand against you as an enemy, and he seems well aware that your respective wills must one day clash. I love it. And what do you know, the final segment will be all about discussing the relationship between Lahabrea and you. Yes, you, the one watching this video. Okay, well, more like your character, but I just wanted to be dramatic.
People have died here, you know, and you do know that, don't you? Tragedy, ain't it?
Now, the three unsundered Ascians are all presented as enemies that we sympathize with. but ones we are nevertheless forced to face and defeat. Here's how I personally view my character's relationship with each of these figures, though keep in mind, this is just my own take and whatever your PC feels about them, well, that's entirely up to you. Anyway, the 3 things I'm going to be focusing on are the headspace we enter the fight in, their relationship with Asm, and what they did following their defeat. So starting with Emet-Selch, I'd classify him as our arch nemesis. He mirrors us as someone who had to carry an immense burden, but our separate worlds made us enemies. I see Emet-Selch as the ultimate opponent for the Warrior of Light, 2 characters that stand opposite to one another thematically and ideologically. Our fragment, Asm, was friends with him in a forgotten era, which caused Emet-Selch a lot of grief, since he wanted to have us measure up to the friend he knew so badly, but his high standards and resentment for the Sundered people simply did not make that possible. After we defeated him, he became an ally and helped us out on multiple occasions, even eventually accepting us as a kind of a spiritual successor to Asm and inspiring us to keep seeking discoveries. Moving on to Elidibus, whom I see as kind of our fated opponent, an enemy we didn't necessarily want to fight, but had no other choice. Elidibus is really a victim of unfortunate circumstance, making our duel against him tragic. Our Asm counterpart was likewise friends with Elidibus, but he had since forgotten about it. After our clash, he became an ally, sacrificing himself to send us to the past. And finally, Lahabrea. He's our mortal enemy, someone we can never find common ground with, standing on peaks separated by vast chasms and with perspectives that will never align, one never giving way to the other. Even our Asm counterpart was diametrically opposed to Lahabrea and never got along. After we defeated him, he returned to us in the form of his ancient memory. We made a temporary alliance, if only so that he could solve a mess that he had started, after which he promptly dissipated. The reason I brought up Asm is that I find it interesting how Lahabrea is the complete opposite end of what Asm represents, and Lahabrea openly states that he isn't very fond of Asm. This makes for such a refreshing change, as most of the ancients we interact with, namely Emet, Benar, Hythro and Elidibus, are all very fond of Asm. But Lahabrea, while he respects Asm for being able to create such a familiar that he himself is incapable of, though funny note on that, Asm didn't actually make it as we know, but it shows that Lahabrea has no issue still crediting Asm where it's necessary is more my point. He just doesn't gel with their outlook on life. And that's only logical, seeing as Asm is a very special seed in the convocation, one that's characterized more by individualistic traits, while Lahabrea is the ideal of their collectivist society, which then of course naturally mirrors how Lahabrea is the one ancient who we never got on truly good terms with. To also elaborate on why I brought up what they did following their defeat, I found those to be very fitting to each character as well. Emet-Selch honors his words before our clash and actively helps you on multiple occasions, Elidibus sacrifices himself, and Lahabrea simply shows up to help fix a mess he's responsible for and yeets. In other words, Emet was sentimental, Elidibus was sacrificial, and Lahabrea was all business. He showed up to help fix the mess and promptly left once his job was done. Well, I said this would be the final segment, but I felt like a little cherry on top would be a good way to finish up the video, so here's my little bonus chapter. Normally I'd have a symbolism segment at the end here, but there are so many references in Pandemonium, and many of them don't even necessarily have anything to do with Lahabrea's character. So I figured, you know what, there's plenty enough stuff there to make a video of its own. I nevertheless wanted to add a tiny bonus snippet, however. The Pandemonium story did a fantastic job at answering a lot of our questions, yet there remains one important unanswered business with Lahabrea. What's the deal with him and Aigirm? I mean, clearly there is something special going on between these two. She's referenced once in the Pandemonium story as having been among the first to spot Lahabrea's behavior following his change. She also appears with Lahabrea in the Elidibus echo scene in Shadowbringers. She doesn't have a name, but if you look at the name of the actors in the game files, Aigirm is the name given to the other ancient, and well, Lahabrea is obviously the speaker there. And even in the Sundered world, the two seem to share some sort of a special relationship. They work closely together, and their trust in each other is shown when together they become the Ascian Prime. This is interesting because obviously the concept of the Unsundered didn't exist back then, so it might simply be a little inconsistency. But I nevertheless would like to ponder, since normally the Unsundered look down on the fragmented Ascians, why was Lahabrea so fond of Aegirm, going so far as to fuse with her? I'm curious to know if you guys have any theories as to the relationship between these two. I'd love to hear it. In any case, it's a shame we didn't get to see Aegirm in the Pandemonium story due to her supposed relationship with both Elidibus and Lahabrea. But then again, the storyline already handled plenty enough Ancients. Maybe we'll eventually get a storyline that explains who she was. Or maybe it'll remain a mystery forever, who knows. Well, to my surprise, about half a year after the Pandemonium story ended, they went ahead and gave us some answers in the form of a side story. In the Tales from the New Dawn side story, Days Gone By, Days Yet to Come, it's revealed that Lahabrea and Aegirm were cousins.
Say what?
This is awesome because we now know there was a connection between these two, which explains the aforementioned things, such as her noticing Lahabrea's behavior following his soul split, or them fusing together to become Ascian Prime. It does also pose interesting questions regarding their personality. The interaction between them in that particular side story is a heated argument, and there's also the fact that one heavily utilizes fiery spells while the other focuses heavily on ice-themed magic. It makes you wonder if there's some sort of a classic case of cousin rivalry going on, with perhaps the two being kind of opposites of one another, and not just in their spellcasting but in personality as well. Emet-Selch describes Aegirm as having an impetuous temperament in regards to her screwing up the 13th, so there seems to be this kind of a duality with these cousins, where Lahabrea is more collected and patient, while Aegirm tends to act more rash. It reminds you of certain twins, don't they? A nice reminder that, deep down, they weren't all that different from us. I also like to imagine that after Aegirm's screw-up in the 13th, Lahabrea was all like, "I told you so," hence why she shifted to closely cooperating with Lahabrea on the source. I also think it's funny that the collected one uses fire spells, while the rash one utilizes ice magic. But I also find it interesting that they retained their closeness despite Lahabrea going kind of crazy, and Aegirm was obviously sundered and had her memories restored. So it makes you wonder if, post-sundering, they even registered the fact that they were cousins, or if they were acting on a kind of an instinct or a gut feeling that drew their souls towards one another. Furthermore, I think this piece of information adds to Lahabrea's demise in a messed up kind of way. We pretty much blasted his only remaining familial tie from existence right in front of his eyes, shortly before the man himself got obliterated. Talk about being as cold as ice. In summary, Lahabrea is a character that went from a complete clown to a fully fleshed out amazing ancient with a strong character arc, particularly due to his bond with his son, Erichtonios, and how he redeems himself as a father, earning his well-deserved spot among the fantastic fathers of Final Fantasy. Yep, so that's been all for today. We've now covered 3 out of the 5 major ancients, and if you want to see my thoughts on Hermes and Elidibus when those videos drop, I recommend subbing as it's the easiest way to stick around. Have a nice day.